Good morning. We are going to be talking this morning about the book of Job. We are in the final lesson of our characters in the book of Genesis class. We'll finish that up today, and then I believe next week we're going to start into the parables. Before we get started, let's begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll dive into the lesson. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful, Lord, that you've given us this time when we can come here and study from thy word. We pray, Lord, that you will help us as we do to learn, to take the things that were given to us and to learn from them and to be able to apply them to our lives, that we may leave here having said that it was good to have studied this. We pray, Lord, that you'll be with all of the teachers. Help us to remember the things we have prepared. Be with the students. Help them to engage. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, with Job, we have kind of a little bit different than what we've had recently with most of our lessons. Most of our recent lessons have been people that we typically don't talk about. Job is a little bit different in that I'm going to guess most of you in here at some point or another have likely spent an entire quarter talking about Job. So we've got one lesson. So we're just going to kind of skim a bit. Hopefully, like I said, we can gather some things from it that we'll be able to use. First of all, what do we know about Job? Who was he? What is it that we are told about Job? Okay, Job was a perfect man. He was a blameless and upright man. He feared God. Anything else you can think of that we know about Job? He had a large family. He was very wealthy. He was a well-to-do man.
He offered sacrifices for his family. He was concerned about the spiritual well-being of his family.
He offered sacrifices for his family. He was concerned for his family. Corey, do we need to make sure? Okay, I didn't mention this. We should. If you have a comment, raise your hand. Corey's going to bring the mic. That way the people that are listening on Zoom will be able to hear everything. So that's what we know about Job. What are some things that we're not told about Job? Because there's a lot of things we're not told about Job. Okay, Mark has.
We don't know when he lived. We have no idea. Was he after Noah? Was he before Abraham? Was it contemporary of Abraham? We don't know.
Yes, and when you look at that, you can find everything. Most people tend to put Job either just prior to or contemporary with Abraham, but you'll find people who put him pre-flood. I found one guy who thought from one of the verses in Job, he was convinced that Job had actually knew of the Exodus. So that would have put him much, much later. So we really don't know when Job lived. Anything else you can think of we're just not told about Job? We're not told where he lived. We're told, well, I take that back. We're told where he lived. We just don't know where it was.
We're told where he's from.
Yeah, but we don't know where that is. And that's another thing that you can find all kinds of things where people are trying to figure out where exactly Uz was, I guess you would say. Where exactly? Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of things we're simply not told about Job. One of the things I didn't mention that we do know about Job, from some of the passages in the book of Job, it appears that Job was not Jewish. Job was either pre-Abraham, in which case there were not Jews, or if he was contemporary or after Abraham, he was not of that lineage. Job was not a Jew. Did you have something, Mark, or? No, okay, no. Okay. Okay. So, we have a lot we don't know about Job, a little we do. What was Satan's challenge to God concerning Job. We have this passage in the beginning of Job that, again, one of the things we don't understand about the book of Job is Job 1:6.
Question, the meaning of Job's name, did you mention that?
I did not. Go ahead.
Because that's an interesting discussion.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I found it meant like he was persecuted or hated, or, and you talked about whether he was Jewish or not. The presumption was that really wasn't a Jewish name, that Job wasn't a Jewish name, and it's not definitively known what it means.
Yeah. One of the things I saw that pointed to him not being Jewish, it talks about the dogs with his herds. Jews didn't do that. It talks about him dividing his wealth between all of his children. The Jews only passed it on to the sons. So there's some things that point to him not being Jewish, besides the fact that we don't see him in any of the lineages. So, did you have your hand up, Mark? Yep, okay. So what was it? Satan challenges God concerning Job. What is this challenge?
Satan basically charges or alleges that Job is faithful to God only because God has blessed him so abundantly that, in other words, of course he does, because he gets something in return for his loyalty.
Yeah. Job is only loyal to you because you've protected him. You've made him wealthy. You've made everything easy for him. No wonder he serves you. Now, this isn't in the book, but I thought about this. I'm just curious what your opinion is. Is there any validity to that? Does Satan have a point? What do you think? Over here.
To this point in the story, yes, that's all we know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was interesting. We typically, this is one I could see going either way, and I was hoping we'd have a little discussion. Typically, we see people reach out to God when times are hard. That's when when times are easy, we tend to ignore God. Mark?
I was going to say one way you could describe this is Job is the original health and wealth gospel. I mean, you could look at it that way because that's what he's saying, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, because you've blessed him so much, and yeah, you know, if you take away the prosperity from him, he'll curse you. He won't follow you anymore. It's health and wealth is the way we would say it today.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of the prosperity gospel. So that was the challenge that Satan posed to God. So what is it that God did? What did God allow Satan to do first? Over here. Yeah.
Leanne?
I saw you first.
Ruby hit, oh, okay. The first thing he did was he started taking away his wealth and his servants. It almost sounded like it all happened in one day. And then at the end, he also killed all of his children, or all the children were killed, or he allowed it.
Yeah, he took away his wealth. He took away everything that Job had physically. So how did Job react to that?
He said, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the Lord.
Yes, exactly. Job stayed, I guess you would say Job stood firm. Okay? Then Satan comes back. Now he has another challenge to God. What was the second challenge he made concerning Job?
The first challenge, he couldn't touch Job. Okay, so that's an important point. The second challenge, Satan tells God, well, he lost his wealth and so on and so forth, but he's still got his health. And God had told him that he couldn't touch him the first time. God says, you can affect his health, but you can't kill him.
Yeah.
So then Satan brings boils from head to toe on Job. But the amazing thing is, he just sits in the ashes and takes a potsherd and scrapes them and just remains true to God. He keeps his faith and remains true to God.
Yeah, Satan basically says, as long as he's got his health, you're still taking care of him. You've still put this fence around him and not let me do anything. You let me take his health, and he'll curse God and die. So by the time we get to chapter 2, what condition is Job in? By the time we get to the end of chapter 2. Yeah, Bob just said pretty pitiful. I think I've got in my notes he was destroyed. This is another thing about Job we don't know. We don't know what it was that Job was dealing with. The kind of classic answer is leprosy. If you Google it, there's a lot of people who have a lot of ideas. Scabies, I saw that one. I saw somebody who said they thought it was complete and total renal failure. That was the way. So we don't know what it was Job was dealing with. But Job was destroyed. Okay? So by the time we get to chapter 2, this is where we see Job. Job is, as Bob said, sitting in a pile of ashes, scraping his skin with a broken piece of pottery. Okay? Now, this wasn't mentioned in the lesson, but I wanted to go into this just a little bit before we kind of get to the thought questions, which is where we'll spend most of the time. But I assumed that most of you had talked about this at some point or another. Let's talk about Job's 3 friends. Were they a comfort to him? No. I see people shaking their heads no. Okay. Yeah, they were about as much comfort as his wife was. That's right, and I didn't even bring her up. What was it Job's wife said to him?
Curse God.
Yeah, Job's wife said, curse God and die. Just give up. It's over. Give it up. Now, does anyone remember, just kind of in general, what it was Job's 3 friends said to him? They did it differently, but there was kind of a common theme among all 3 of them.
Well, before we go into that, I do want to point out in the scriptures, it says that they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him.
Yep.
So it seems as though their purpose
Yes.
was coming from the right place.
Yes.
It just unfortunately was fraught with misunderstanding.
I actually saw, and I'll throw this out there for free if anybody wants a sermon title, I saw a guy that had written an article, What Job's Friends Got Right. And that was one of the points. They had planned together to come and comfort him. They made a plan. They did it. They had the right purpose in mind. They were coming to comfort a friend. So they got that right. But when they got there, they didn't have it quite right. And what was it? What was their general, I guess the general theme? What was it Job's 3 friends, what was their thought about Job's suffering?
I would summarize as they bought into health and wealth too.
Yes.
And so if you're not healthy and you're not wealthy, you must have done something wrong that God is punishing you for this.
Yeah. That was it.
Confess your fault, Job.
Yeah. That was exactly it. Job's 3 friends, in various different ways, said, you've obviously sinned somehow, and God is punishing you. Otherwise, this wouldn't have happened. So you need to confess. You need to just confess up to your sins.
Get your workout today. Something that's interesting to me that I never noticed until right now, but is, goodness gracious, now I lost it. But at Eliphaz, I believe it is, yeah. He says to him that, in verse 5, but now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God and your confidence and your integrity of your ways and hope? The word integrity is used in the book of Proverbs sometimes to imply reality. And it's a form of the word blameless, oddly enough, but it's the idea that he's saying to him, listen, you're a good guy. I mean, he's calling to the best in him. You're obviously a good guy. You want the good things. That has been your goal. Now, accept the reality that something has happened, And it happened not for no reason.
Yeah. Yep. Very good. Now, we remember, was there anything else on the three friends? Then we get Elihu. Elihu seems to be, I guess you would say, the fourth friend, the one we don't talk about. He's the one who comes before him and says, I wasn't going to say anything because I'm younger. I've let all of you talk. And then he spends about 5 chapters talking. What does he say? Does anyone remember what it is Elihu says in general? Can you summarize those 5 chapters? He begins by rebuking the 3 friends. He tells them they aren't a comfort. You came to comfort and you're not doing it. Then he rebukes Job. And what Elihu ends up saying, and I'm going to paraphrase this, basically, God is God and you're not. And you need to realize that God doesn't always tell you why he does things. And we need to accept what God has said. And like I said, that's paraphrasing that quite a bit. But in those 5 chapters, that seems to me to be the theme we see over and over again. You're not going to be able to discern what God is doing simply because you think you're wise enough to figure it out. And Elihu says that kind of over and over in different ways. Then we see God answer Job. And that's in chapter 38. How does God answer Job?
You're asking me questions of heaven and you don't even understand how the earth operates.
Yeah. Basically, you're not God, and I am. And we see Job, I guess you would say, put in his place. This is also the passage where we see God talk about Leviathan and Behemoth, which is very interesting. That's a completely different way to thing to go into. But this is where we see God basically tell Job to be quiet. Tell Job's 3 friends to be quiet. He's God and you're not. And then finally, when we get to the end of the book of Job, how does the book of Job end? Let's see if I can stop this silly thing from beeping. No. How does the book end?
In the last chapter, 42, in verse 12, it said, So the Lord blessed the later end of Job more than his beginning, for he had 4,000 sheep and 6,000 camels. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters.
Okay. So we see at the book of Job. Oh, go ahead.
Leanne and I were talking about this, and it says nothing about it, but you almost assume that he would have had to marry again, perhaps, because he has 7 more kids. You don't know how old he was when all this started, but for her to bear, the children that he had that died, one presumes were fairly grown.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't find any commentaries or anything that related to that, but it almost sounds like he might have had to remarry. I don't know.
I don't know. Now, one of the things I did read that I thought was interesting. Yeah. One of the things that I did read that I thought was interesting, and this was just kind of a very side point. So we often make the point where Job says, I have never looked on the young virgins, that, Job didn't cheat on his wife. I read someone who said that's probably not what that passage means. What that passage probably means is Job didn't have multiple wives. At a time when polygamy was kind of the standard, Job was a one-woman man. And I thought that was interesting. Again, not a huge point, but
The one thing I would have to say about Job's wife is she was going through the same things he was.
That's
She
true.
she just couldn't stand up to it like he could.
yeah,
Her
she
anger
didn't
got the
handle it
best
as
of
well
her.
as he did. And that's true. We probably sometimes are very hard on Job's wife, not thinking of that point right there. Job wasn't the only one that lost children. That's a good point. Mark?
To that point, in comparison, you think about people who struggle with their faith when they lose a child, for example. And you think here, what did Job lose? He lost not only all his children, he lost all his possessions as well.
Yeah.
You know, all the things that he had. Basically, his life's efforts were all erased from him in a day.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're not given a timestamp, but yeah, it appears that this happened in a very, very short period of time, and Job loses everything. So, that is kind of, I wanted to go through all of that because that's kind of that's the background. That's the book of Job. Now, the rest of the time, let's spend on the thought questions. How is Job a type of Christ? What do you think? These actually, I just copied them out of the book. These are the questions in the bottom of the book. How is Job a type of Christ? Or, maybe I should ask it this way, is Job a type of Christ? Because I found online when I was doing some research, the first two I clicked on, one guy had 3.5 pages of the ways that Job is a type of Christ, and the next one that I clicked on, the gentleman was very adamant that Job was not. What do you think? Is Job a type of Christ? Yeah.
There are certainly some aspects that are similar. He was blameless, so he was an innocent man, and he suffered tremendously, as Christ was innocent of anything, suffered tremendously for us. And also, he, even though these friends aren't friends, he intercedes for them. He
Yep.
saves them, if you will. I don't know a better way to say that. And also Job's sacrifices and so on and so forth, he takes really very quietly, very more peacefully than you would think the average person would. He just accepts them, as Leanne mentioned. He says, "Blessed be the name of the Lord. Lord giveth, Lord taketh away." And so he's very at peace. And obviously Jesus, his sacrifice was the same way.
Yep. That's good. One of the things that was mentioned that I saw that any of these people that we look at that we say are a type of Christ, you can take that too far. We're starting next week when we get into the parables. I'm sure we'll talk about that on some of them. There are things in the parables that people can take too far, try to make a point that isn't there. But we can look at this and say, this happened to Job for us, because we're supposed to learn from it. Job suffered so that we can learn about suffering. Job suffered so that maybe we can deal with it a little better. And I thought that was an interesting, I'm not sure that makes him a type of Christ, but I thought it was an interesting point. Anything else on this one? Anybody else have any thinking about Job as a type of Christ? What about his character? If you were just going to describe Job's character, how would you describe it?
With what, excuse me, with what you said there, as you were saying that, I was thinking about that as we prosper, maybe, we able to do things, that we want to do and what we prosper in life, then sometimes at that point, we have a tendency to forget about the lesson that we learned from Job. We kind of get back on the selfish side and want to satisfy ourselves. And if we're real prosperous, we want to get a bigger house, get another car. And I think that's where we, as a Christian, need to be careful.
Yep. That's the other side of what Satan challenged God with. Satan says, you just protect Job, or Job only respects you because you protect him. Sometimes we do just the opposite. We become successful and we forget where it came from. We forget about God. We turn around and go, wow, look what I've done. Now, when times are bad, we want to turn to God. The old adage is there's no atheist in a foxhole. When times are hard, everybody wants to serve God. Go ahead, Gene.
As you were saying that, and I think I've brought this up here before, in my life, at one point, my boss comes to me and tells me that, the company is going to have to go to court, and you will be put on the stand, and this is what you have to say. Well, I've been at this company about 20 years. I didn't want to leave the company. I had a good job, but my job was threatened unless I went to court and lied.
Yep.
So that was quite I don't think that's a hard decision for me to make, tell you the truth. I just told him, I said, I've been working this company 20 years, and this is not the way I conduct my life and the way I work with people. And you better not put me on the stand, because you put me on the stand, I won't lie.
Yeah.
So that was a challenge, and as it worked out, I got a better job. Things were better.
Yep. Yeah. That was to use this adage, that was a curse God and die moment. Here's the easy way out. What about relevance? We just talked about the fact that this is a book. It is possible that Job is the earliest book of the Bible that we have. How is that relevant thousands of years later to us?
If we look at the message of Job as, will a man worship God because he is God only? If that's the only reason, would we worship God? If you look at that, it's as relevant today now as it ever was. The fact that each of us, will we worship, if we worship God, why will we do it? What's the motive for worshiping God? And the motive that, the book of Job, it shakes everything out and says, will you worship God just because he's God? If you get no benefit from it, you receive no blessing from it at all, would you worship him simply because he's God?
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. I heard many years ago, a gentleman was preaching a lesson, and he made a point that along those lines. He said, we're blessed in that we serve a loving God. But we don't serve God because he's loving. We serve God because he's God. And sometimes we forget that.
Things we need to be reminded of today, and Mark mentioned, I think it was Mark that said, we see people, they might lose an infant or something, and their faith wavers and so on and so forth. We all know of situations like that. We need to remember God's ways aren't our ways. And that's what God told Job. My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. You can't understand the big picture that God can see. And that's as relevant today as it was then, obviously, because we don't understand where God will take us and our roles and what will happen and so on and so forth. And we need to accept, just as Gene talked about, he could have said, I'm not going to do it, and they fired him and so on and so forth. That would have been That would have been the way it was supposed to be, I guess. But we need to understand God's ways aren't our ways, and I think that's probably a key point from Job.
Yep.
Jesus brings up the same kind of discussion. Remember, it's in Luke 13, because, there, I tell you, except you repent, you shall all likewise perish. That verse, the verse we often remember, it's brought up in a discussion of, he's talking about these people that perished in when the Tower of Siloam fell. Do you think that those were sinners above all else? Because the Jews had the same reasoning that Job's friends did, right? Is that, when something bad happens to you, you must have been a sinner. That's why, it's God's retribution on you. And then Jesus asked the question, this tower fell on these poor unfortunate people. Were they all sinners, and that's why the tower fell on them? And he begs the question to them, you need to rethink your understanding about God and punishment, right? So I'm just saying that was Jesus taking the theme of Job and applying it to them at that day and time.
One of the things as I was reading through this that someone pointed out that, again, I hadn't thought of before, we're not told that Job ever knew why any of this happened. Think about that. We're not told that Job ever knew that he lost everything because Satan challenged God concerning him. Job is likely to have gone to his grave not knowing why this happened.
Well, taking that and going further, pardon me, I would even go so far as to say that that was the point of God's discourse with him at the end. I don't think it was a rebuke in any way, shape, or form of Job. I think it was a compassionate explanation of, I can't explain it to you. If I tried, you couldn't possibly understand it, because this is something that happened in the heavenly realm and you don't even understand the earthly realm. And again, so like say, I think that it was an attempt to comfort Job in the best way that Job was capable of receiving it.
Okay, that's a neat point. I hadn't thought of that way, because I'd always thought of it as God rebuking Job. That's an interesting point. Mark?
The other thing about Job that we haven't discussed is, you learn about Satan. You think about Satan's role here. The one thing we understand is he can take something that's perfectly fine and make something seem unseemly about it, or dark, something dark about it. Job is faithful to God. He worships God. He provides sacrifices in case his children have sinned against God. And Satan turns that into an accusation, because that word it can also mean, Satan can mean the accuser. And you describe it as what's Satan's job. He will tempt you, he'll get you to fail, and then he'll be the one that gets in front of God and accuses you of the sin that he caused you to do. That's who he is. He is the accuser. He delights in accusing people of things, whether they did it or not, to make it seem dark. And that's exactly what he's doing here. In his conversation with God, he's taking a perfectly faithful Job and making it seem like there's something wrong with Job.
Yep, that's a good point. Gene? You're walking up. Daryl, to your point, and I was thinking of that this morning, and I had the passage, and now I've lost it. I believe it's in Ephesians, where it talks about the principalities and the powers. The idea that there's things going on that we don't understand and we don't know. I think that's a very good point. Gene, go ahead.
Yeah, as Mark was saying that, went through my mind, and I'm sure most of you. At age 15, when I obeyed the gospel, I had no idea what my life was going to be. In other words, I didn't even really think about my life, of what I'd be doing or this or that. At age 15, I obeyed the gospel. Now, at my age now, where I am in life now, I really know, the life that I've had by following God. And that's kind of along the lines, I guess, of where we're told to put God first, priorities. Put that as a priority. Don't try to figure out, where I'm going to put God. Number 3 or what, if I want to have a $1 million house, a lot of people don't think about God, So that's the important, or that's at least in my life that I've felt.
One of the things that I got from Job, and again, I hear this phrase all the time, that everything happens for a reason. And between Job and Jesus' parallel with the Tower of Siloam, I understand what they mean, but at the same time, you don't know the reason. And when people say that, they assume that God has this purpose he's trying to transact in your life, and thus it's happened. What we learn from Job is God's got a reason sometimes, Satan has a reason sometimes, time and chance happens sometimes, and my own will and my own impotence happens sometimes. So we can't just attribute everything to God, though he allows it. It may not be his purposes at will whenever something happens.
Turning to the book of James, 2 passages that I think are relevant here. Chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And I think endurance is one of the things that correctly describes Job, and that word means to bear up under. It isn't that, I just wait patiently. It's the idea that I am bound to God's will as I know it, and I'm going to keep crawling forward even whenever I don't have a clue what's going on, and I'm still going to try and do right as I know it to be. Next verse is a verse that I think a lot of times is read very disdainfully as far as the tone to it, and I don't think it's there, but it's verse 7, "For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." Again, that's another passage that I think we take as a rebuke. And what it really is meant to be is an explanation of, if I approach the controversial and difficult aspects of my life with a mindset of, I love God, I want to do right, but I really want the pain to stop, I'm probably going to be impeded from understanding the lesson. I'm not going to gain wisdom. It's an explanation. It's not saying that I'm double-minded, I don't really love God. No, I love God. I can be entirely devoted to God. But if I really want to gain wisdom, I've got to be asking the question which Job did ask, and that is, why is this happening? There's nothing wrong with asking that. In fact, I believe it is a good and godly thing to do, because that's how I come to understand my relationship with God better.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think just when everyone was talking, we often make the point that Job lost everything. I think the point I hear people making is Job didn't really lose everything. There was something Job held on to. Job held on to his integrity, his faith. Job never lost God. God didn't, and sometimes we feel like that. Sometimes we feel like God doesn't care anymore. That was Job's friends. Obviously, God has turned away from you. Bad things are happening. God doesn't love you anymore. But Job didn't. Yeah.
So I think it's interesting too in Job 42, just the first one. And Job replied to the Lord, "I know you can do anything, and no plan of yours can be thwarted." So to me, like you just said, he didn't lose the one thing that mattered. And it's amazing to me that we have such a loving and understanding God that he knows that we find comfort and joy in these physical things, right? And he understands that it does bring us some happiness. And it's just surprising to me how often we see people getting rewarded with what we would consider worldly things. And that's what's interesting to me, that there's, he receives, however many fold at the end of his life, more than he had before. So not only does God put us through very tough things to try us, to, for us to build our faith on, those are opportunities for us to learn how to strengthen ourselves. And it's important to see that God knows us so well, that he knows, just like a parent gifts a child something, right? We know what makes our children happy. We want to give them those things. To me, it just shows that exponential love that he has for us, that when we are faithful through those things, whether they're big trials or small trials, he's there for us now and will be there for us in the end as well.
Good. What about sin and suffering? Is there anything that we should learn about sin and suffering when we look at Job? And I think go ahead.
Things that I learned about, a long time ago, but when I was adult, is God doesn't do things to people. God allows things to happen, but God doesn't smite people and curse them and things like that. But sometimes he pulls protection away, and I think he does that to countries too. He did it to Israel. He didn't go down and hurt Israel. He pulled his protection away and allowed other people to do it. And I think that's what happens when we sin also. Sometimes he pulls his protection away from us.
But yet we still say, why is God doing this to me? We focus on ourselves instead of on God. Kendrick?
What Job really does for me is look, and that question is a great question, because there's two different things there, right? The sin part is the scariest thing when it all boils down to it, right? Because that will cost you eternity. The suffering part is how we in our minds and our, finite minds say that I don't have the best health, I'm losing everything I have, physically here in this earth. So what Job teaches me is that I am the only one who can truly have a loss when it comes to my faith. Everything else doesn't matter. The kids, the wives, the monies, the animals, name it, right? You can make a list a mile long. None of that matters. It's the sin that matters. It's that no matter what's going on in this physical life, that you make sure that you are right with God, and nothing else matters.
Yeah, that's very good. I think I have one more up here, and the bell's about ready to ring. This is just kind of the big, if you had to come up with one big lesson from the book of Job, what would you say?
I think it relates to us today, with the virus and the election and the world and so on and so forth. One of the things that Job had to remember, and one of the things we have to remember, is God's in control. Absolutely. That's my big takeaway that I get from Job. God's in control. He has his reasons. He has his purposes. We don't understand them. We're not going to understand them because his ways aren't our ways.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. It's going to be okay. A lot of times we don't think that. A lot of times we look at the world around us, whether it's the entire world around us or whether or not it's our little bitty world just right around us, and we think it's not going to be okay. The lesson we need to learn from Job is it's going to be okay. Even if Job had never gotten back twice as much of everything this is what he did, it still was going to be okay. And that, to me, is kind of the big takeaway. I think we've got time. If anybody else wants to have the last word, we should be ringing here in a minute, but...
Yeah, the other part here, to me, the thread that ran through a lot of the interchanges between all these people is that idea of health and wealth, that God will, if we're good, then God will always bless us materially, and the book of Job sets that idea aside on both sides of the issue, really. And the other part of it, I think is interesting, is that Christ takes that up too, because that same idea had returned. And yet, when we look at Jesus, think about this. You look at the fact that Jesus suffered as well, like Job, so that we could benefit from it. You know, so that's the twist here. Job is a lesson to us about prosperity and God, you know, God moving in the kingdoms of men and so on, and time and chance happens to all men. Jesus is an example that shows us that God wants what is best for us and was willing to send his own son to provide it.
Very good. Well, thank all of you for your help this morning. And next week we will start the parables. Who has the first parable, or what is the first parable? Does anyone know off the top of their head?
Sower.